Good evening, it's Wednesday, January 18th. Welcome to a new episode of System Update, our new live nightly show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively here on Rumble, the free speech alternative to YouTube. To start off tonight, I'll offer a quick update on the ongoing censorship crisis in Brazil. Just an hour ago, I participated in a live debate hosted by Brazil's largest newspaper, Folha of São Paulo, to discuss the reporting we did on an extremely alarming and radical censorship order. We revealed that Friday night that the court had demanded be kept secret, but which we were able to get a hold of, and after ample consultation with our Brazilian lawyers, decided to reveal and denounce. And I want to offer some observations about that debate that I just had and what it reflects about how governments not only abuse their power, but how they are so effective in inducing populations to support them in seizing this radical power and then abusing it. Given that most of my day was, I will confess, devoted to preparation for that debate, we'll spend a considerable amount of time speaking tonight with the independent journalist Michael Tracey, who I think always has interesting and thoughtful things to say, even when you want to kill him and don't agree with him. We'll discuss a wide range of topics, including how Auburn University banned the social media platform TikTok, how numerous Republican senators, such as Marco Rubio, are now attempting to implement legislation to ban that platform in the United States, the latest about how the U.S. continues to escalate its role in the increasingly dangerous war in Ukraine. While you're not looking, they are escalating, spending huge amounts more money, sending more sophisticated weaponry, and at least some attention is merited. We'll also spend time analyzing a new and very creepy panel discussion at the World Economic Forum in which an EU official haughtily warned Americans to expect that what she considers hate speech will soon be criminalized here in the United States, notwithstanding the little problem of our First Amendment. And we'll also talk to Michael about a fascinating conflict between Scotland and England over a law which he reported on a couple of weeks ago on our show that was just implemented over the opposition of the vast majority of the Scottish population to allow trans people to be legally treated as a different gender based on nothing more than their self-declaration. It's causing a genuine crisis of power within the United Kingdom over whether or not Scotland has the right to implement this law. As always, as soon as we're done here with our 1 hour show on Rumble, we will move to Locals for our interactive after show to take your questions and comment on your feedback. To obtain access to that after show, simply sign up as a member to our Locals community. The red button is on the right-hand corner right below our video. For now, welcome to a new episode of System Update, starting right now. So, to remind you of the context for the debate in which I've been involved and the reporting I've been doing about what is absolutely characterized fairly only as a radical censorship regime in Brazil, and the reasons that I think even if you don't live in Brazil, you not only ought to care about it, but it will soon affect your life if it hasn't already. Just to provide the context for you, last Friday night on our program, shortly before we went on air, we obtained a copy of what was a genuinely creepy and chilling censorship order. It was issued by a single judge on the Brazilian Supreme Court, whose name is Alexandre de Moraes. He has become so authoritarian in his use of censorship powers that even the New York Times, by which I mean that the New York Times is a clearly progressive newspaper that is very vehemently opposed to Donald Trump and Jair Bolsonaro, and generally supportive of censorship regimes in general, including the one that has emerged in the United States, even the New York Times, interestingly, right before the Brazilian election on October 2nd, published two separate articles, one in September, another in October, written by the Brazil bureau chief, to his credit, that raised very serious concerns and gave voice to very emphatic warnings about the authoritarian nature of the censorship regime that is being constructed right before your eyes here in Brazil. And the order that we obtained was remarkable. We got it just a couple of hours before we went on air, and we took a lot of our time to speak with our Brazilian lawyers about whether it was advisable for us to report on it. That's the climate that has really been created here in Brazil, is people are afraid to criticize this judge. I mean, obviously, some people, if they're polite and mild enough in their criticisms, and if they're people who are considered with the right credentials within the world of legal specialties and judicial analyses. I'm having trouble translating the words that I usually use in Portuguese to English for a moment. But even if you're somebody like that and your criticisms of him are tepid and polite enough, you can generally get away with it. But for people who are criticizing him a bit more aggressively, there's valid reasons to be concerned. He has summarily ordered his critics banned from the entire internet or from every social media platform. He has even ordered a member of Congress who he believed crossed the line from criticizing him to threatening violence against him to be in prison for 9.5 years, a member of Congress. And he was saved from that sentence only because then President Bolsonaro pardoned him. But the powers that he has been using are, whether you agree with them or not, objectively radical in the sense that there's very few other countries in the democratic world that have a framework of censorship the way that Brazil has implemented. And what made this order so chilling, it was an order that was issued to 6 different social media companies, including Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Rumble. I believe there's one other that I'm not remembering off the top of my head, but those were 5. And it essentially, Telegram was the 6th. And it ordered every one of those social media sites to immediately censor not a single video or remove a single post, but to entirely ban, with no time frame, so presumably permanently, a list of individuals whom he decided he thought should be banned from these social media platforms. And among the people who he ordered banned were politicians who were just elected with a very large vote total 3 months ago in that October election. In other words, they're people who Brazilians decided through a democratic election want them to represent these Brazilians in the government, including one of the people who was on the list, a 26-year-old supporter of Jair Bolsonaro, Nicolas Ferreira, who
I'm not on air, am I?
the most votes of any candidate for Congress in Brazil, 1.4 million. He got the highest vote total of any single candidate running for Congress. He was one of the people who the secret order just said, this person shall be banned from all of your platforms. Another was a longtime member of Congress since 2014, an evangelical pastor who just got elected to the Senate in his state. It's very difficult to get elected to the Senate like it is in the United States. He just got a big vote total, was elected by the citizens of his state to represent them in the Senate. He was another person ordered by this platform to be censored. And then others were commentators and activists and a whole wide range of people. And what was extraordinary about this order were several things. Number one is within the order was a command to these social media platforms to do everything in their ability to ensure the secrecy of this order. They weren't allowed to talk about it publicly. They weren't allowed to object. They weren't allowed to talk to journalists about it. They weren't allowed to provide the order to journalists. They were ordered, including American social media platforms who have no presence in Brazil, such as Rumble, not only to obey this order, but to maintain it as secret. So had we not gotten a hold of one of the orders and had we not been willing to show it to you, it's very possible that those censorship orders would have been obeyed, and to this day, the people who were censored would never have known why. And the platforms themselves wouldn't have known why either, because the other remarkable part about this order, it was only 4 pages long. Not only was it bereft of any evidence, it was bereft of any specific allegation. People have no idea why these people were censored. They can guess. There's some speculation. I've seen even people defending the censorship regime on the Brazilian left saying maybe it was this tweet or maybe it was this tweet. They have no idea why. They just know they're in favor of the censorship, even though there was nothing specific contained in the order that constituted even an accusation, let alone evidence to demonstrate guilt. And when we started calling the people who were the targets of this order, they had no idea that this order had been issued. They had no notification, let alone due process, no opportunity to enter into a court. Some of them had their livelihoods destroyed by this, by being banned by these platforms. Some of them are politicians who see social media as a necessary way to communicate with their constituents or to participate in the public debate. None of them had any idea that this order had been issued, nor would they have had any idea had we not revealed it. So there was no due process, no specific accusation, no anything other than a command, and it gave the social media platforms a grand total of 2 hours to comply. The order explicitly says you are to comply with this and ban these sites and ban these people within 2 hours, not 2 days or 2 weeks, but 2 hours within receipt of this order. And for every day that you fail to comply, you will be fined 100,000 reais per day, which is $20,000 per day or $100,000 per week if they don't immediately obey. Now, it's almost hard to imagine a censorship regime more extreme or concerning than that one, because it's not just the censorship, it's the total lack of due process. And we interviewed one of the people who was the target of this, and he confirmed he had no prior knowledge of this, no opportunity to contest the allegations made against him, absolutely nothing. So to say that that reporting that we did created major repercussions in Brazil is to understate the case. And last night I gave you an update at the very end of the show for a few minutes about exactly what those repercussions were. But having just participated in the debate with a fellow journalist, a Brazilian journalist who for a long time worked for Folha, the largest newspaper, and it was hosted by another journalist who also works for Folha, who herself has been targeted by the Bolsonaro movement with all kinds of attacks personally over the internet. So both of them were essentially fully in agreement with the censorship regime. And as the New York Times itself said, basically the entire corporate media in Brazil is united with the Brazilian left. It's ironic because the Brazilian left, like the American left, likes to think of itself as the enemy of the corporate media, but in reality, as so often happens in the United States as well, the Brazilian left is united now with the corporate media, including Globo, the biggest media corporation in the country that they always used to accuse of being anti-democratic and fascist, because they are and they were. But now suddenly the left and the corporate media find themselves on the same side ever since the emergence of Bolsonaro and his movement, just like the American left finds itself on the same side of the CIA, the FBI, and the entire corporate media, the NBC News in the United States. So the dynamic is the same. You almost can't find a member of the corporate media in Brazil willing to question, let alone criticize, this censorship regime. So I was reflecting on several parts of this debate I just had, and honestly, the thing that amazed me the most, well, two things. These are the 2 points I wanted to make, because I think when you can understand how the human brain functions, how the human psyche can be exploited by authorities, it can help in many ways see the threats emerging in your own country and think about how to fight against them, but also understand why they're successful. So to start off with, and this sounds like a technical point, and on some level it is, it's not as exciting as these broader themes of free speech and due process. The law that was implemented that allows this judge to issue these orders, essentially ordering anybody and anything that he wants off of the internet with no appeal, no transparency, no due process, was a law that was very newly implemented that was based on the argument that the integrity of the election happening in Brazil in October 22 required protection from disinformation. And so it empowered this judge, acting alone, to decide what is true and what is false, and therefore to ban from the internet anything he decided was false or was disinformation. That is, or what constituted anti-democratic actions, meaning incitement to violence or attempts to overthrow the democratic framework in Brazil, all in his unilateral judgment, no trial or anything else. But the understanding of this law and the way they defended it, even for people who were questioning it and found it worrying, was, oh, don't worry. This law is just temporary. It's just for the election. And as soon as the election is over, said one of the key members of the Supreme Court, Carmen Lucia, she said, as soon as the election is over, the very next day, this law will cease to exist, which was October 31st. And yet here Alessandro de Moraes is continuing to use this power that was supposed to be dependent on the existence of the election, even though the election was over almost 3 months ago. Very similar to how the Patriot Act, we were told, would be temporary just as soon as we got this terrorism problem under control. Nobody worries about Al-Qaeda any longer, or ISIS. And yet the Patriot Act is not only in full force 22 years later, but nobody even thinks about, with a few exceptions, trying to reform it, let alone repeal it. And so the fact that no one on the left or in the media seems to care that this judge is using powers that have no legal basis reveals to me something extremely disturbing, which is when you give a political group an intoxicating power, such as the ability to censor your enemies and punish your political adversaries, imagine what a feeling of power that gives you. You know, it was like what we saw with Elon Musk when he bought Twitter and was suddenly the sole owner. Imagine if you were using Twitter and had the opportunity or the ability at any moment to just click delete or block or ban. That's hard. That's a hard power to resist, and he didn't resist it on several occasions. I think he's made strides in avoiding that, but you saw that dynamic at play. But it's an incredibly intoxicating power, and so when you convince a group of people that their political adversaries are no longer just political opponents, but are this grave and existential threat to everything decent, to democracy, to freedom, that you're fighting the new Hitler, as many in the United States got American citizens to believe, and as absolutely much of the Brazilian left and even parts of the center left believe, that we're fighting not a political movement that's a right-wing movement with which we disagree, but a fascist Nazi movement that wants to overthrow Brazilian democracy, even though they participated in the elections and did very well in them. Once you convince yourself that, you stop caring about things like ethical limits or legal limits or constitutional guarantees. The attitude emerges almost explicitly that the threat that we face is so grave that we can't afford the luxury of caring about those kind of trivialities, like limits on the legal power of authorities or constitutional guarantees. Those are boring technicalities that maybe in normal times we can care about, but right now we're not in normal times and therefore we can't. That is, however dangerous you think the Bolsonaro movement is or the furthest right-wing sector of it is, that mentality is at least as dangerous, and I would argue more so, wherever it emerges. That's what history demonstrates. The other point I wanted to make is, one of the lessons I think most of us learned in the United States after the September 11th attack was that sometimes threats can be very real, but the dangers of allowing the government to claim unlimited power in the name of fighting those threats can be even more dangerous. I mean, I was somebody who lived and worked in New York for 10 years when 9/11 happened. I lived in Manhattan. I was in my office in Manhattan when it happened. I remember walking around for weeks seeing those horrible signs of desperate families continuing to try and believe that people who were obviously dead under the rubble were somehow with amnesia in hospitals. It was an incredibly traumatizing moment. And talk about a real threat. This wasn't a case like January 6th in the US or January 8th in Brazil, where people invaded government buildings by breaking windows with chairs and destroying art and furniture. They flew a commercial jet filled with people and fuel for an intercontinental flight into the Pentagon, the center of American military power. That, whatever you think of it, that was a real attack. And yet I think one of the lessons that people have learned, including people who supported the war on terror, which was roughly 70% of the American public, and I've heard Fox hosts say this, I've heard conservative politicians say it, is the lesson we learned is we have to guard against overreaction. We can't just give in to whatever powers the government demands, even if they're claiming that they need these powers to protect us against what in fact is an actual threat, as 9/11 was. But it's amazing to watch another country, Brazil, repeat that exact dynamic to the point where the few people who are willing to stand up and question what this judge is doing get accused of being pro-terrorist or on the side of the terrorists, just like anyone questioning Bush and Cheney or the Patriot Act or the war in Afghanistan, such as Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who, whatever else you think of her, deserves immense credit as the one person willing to vote against authorizing military force in Afghanistan on the ground that doing so would lead to an endless war and wouldn't end up changing anything in Afghanistan. Whatever you think of her in that argument, she certainly was proven prescient and vindicated after 20 years when we left and the Taliban returned to power. Everyone who stood up and questioned the government in that climate was deemed a terrorist or a terrorist lover, a sympathizer of terrorism. And it's an incredibly powerful demonizing tactic to prevent assent, because as human beings, we are still tribal. 5,000 years ago, being expelled from our tribe meant death. And even though we can survive much more on our own now, we still need and crave, even the most independent among us, some kind of approval or connection to the broader society. And so the ability to brand somebody as a terrorist supporter for not immediately accepting every power claim by the government is a very potent one. And we're seeing in Brazil right now, in the face of a threat that I would argue was clearly less grave than what happened on September 11th, no matter how grave you think it is, we're seeing history repeat itself because the human psyche just doesn't change. So for our interview segment, we will now talk to independent journalist Michael Tracey about a wide range of topics, and I'm certain that you will find whatever he says to be at least provocative if you don't agree with it. But there's a lot of things to talk about. I'm looking forward to the conversation. Good evening, Michael. Congratulations on having the privilege to listen to that monologue that I'm sure you found extremely fulfilling and gratifying and enlightening. And I appreciate your coming back to our show.
First of all, I would never dream of provoking anyone. And I know you feel a similar aversion to ever provoking anyone, so I resent that remark.
Yeah, I mean, just to be clear, when I say that oftentimes your arguments are provocative, I don't mean that you intend to provoke. You intend to do nothing but spread peace and love and harmony like Lex Friedman does. It's just that sometimes, against your will, your arguments end up being provocative. So let's start off with an issue that you've spent a lot of time provoking people about since the beginning, which is the war in Ukraine, which I think very safely now can be called the U.S. proxy war in Ukraine. I mean, if you're not willing to call it that, you're completely disconnected from any semblance of reality. And one of the things we've seen and that you've spent a lot of time pointing out is this kind of very inexorable escalation where things that we declared from the start of the war or even months into the war that we would never do because it's just too dangerous are things that we always then end up doing. So talk about your latest view on these developments in Ukraine and specifically some of these new escalations.
Well, it's interesting because some of it even relates to the terminology used to describe the conflict or the intervention. Proxy war, for example. I was on Tucker Carlson's show in March of last year from Poland when I took a trip there after the war started to sort of observe the infrastructural deployments that the U.S. military had undertaken. And I used the word proxy war on air and, of course, was attacked viciously by Media Matters for repeating Russian talking points and simply using that term. Apparently, they did not know that Leon Panetta had himself used that term, the former defense secretary for the Obama administration, former chief of staff and CIA director. He had personally used that same term. I didn't see Media Matters attack him as peddling Russian talking points. I even requested a clarification from Media Matters on that score. I never received anything. So it's interesting that because nowadays, if you use the word proxy war, maybe you'll get some objections here and there, but it's pretty well accepted that that's a reasonable characterization of the nature of the U.S. military intervention. So I don't even really call it a proxy war at this point. I call it an intervention because it requires an enormous amount of resources and manpower commitment, obviously money in terms of the hundreds of tens of billions of dollars that have already been allocated by the U.S. for the project since last February. to me, there's every reasonable criteria that's been met that classifies the event itself as an intervention. But it's not even really called that because people think that maybe overstates the U.S. role. But anyway, the more recent developments have to do with the dispatchment or the announced dispatchment of tank squadrons to Ukraine. Because, if you think back to 6 months ago, 8 months ago, it would have been seen as a bridge too far to even really contemplate deploying Western-made tanks to Ukraine for use in combat operations. The U.S. did pretty quickly start facilitating the transfers of Soviet-era tank equipment to Ukraine through different NATO members, it's like Romania and whatnot. But the idea that the U.S. would send its own brand of tanks to Ukraine was seen as untenable because there would be too much of an escalation and too direct of an intervention to be tolerable. So what happened in the past week or two is that the British government, famously known as the poodle of the United States, or to use another canine metaphor, a lapdog, decided at the direction of Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, that the UK would be directly deploying its own tank squadrons to Ukraine, which is a huge step forward in terms of the intensity of the, quote, Western or NATO military commitment. Even the New York Times, when it was reporting on the possibility of this happening, said it would break a taboo. Well, why was it a taboo? Because it was rightly understood to represent a gigantic escalation in the nature and method of the U.S.-led intervention in the war, with the UK being like kind of the second most prominent participant, just like was the case of Iraq.
Let me interrupt you there for a second, if I could. Just so, when the war began, the idea was, well, look, we don't want to get involved beyond just sending some assistance, and maybe not even that. There was questions about that, but maybe we'll send some assistance, but we don't want to get too involved because doing that will be provocative and dangerous since Russia is a nuclear armed power, and we've always tried more or less to avoid a direct confrontation with Russia, even going back to the Cold War, where we fought each other through proxy wars, but never fought each other directly. That's a good thing because the United States and Russia remain the two largest nuclear powers on the planet, and you don't want them directly confronting one another. What now, though, when it comes to this declaration that we're going to help Ukraine win the war or fend off this invasion, what do you see now as the actual risk? I mean, what can Russia do to the United States as meaningful retaliation that we ought to be afraid of?
Well, I mean, maybe the trivially obvious answer there is Russia has the world's largest nuclear arsenal. Joe Biden himself made one of the most remarkable statements a United States president has ever made last October when he just casually rattled off at a fundraiser that the U.S. and the world faces the greatest risk of nuclear conflagration since the Cuban Missile Crisis, almost exactly 60 years before that. So when you're asking what is the risk or what is the potential danger that the U.S. can encounter for going down this course, I mean, that's the answer. I mean, you'll see it repeated in popular media that according to Russian military doctrine, so somehow all these pundits have such a firm grasp on Russian military doctrine and Russian nuclear doctrine, but ignore the equivalents in the United States. Anyway, but all the pundits know that Russian nuclear doctrine, or at least their understanding of it, is that the nuclear weapons will be used when the Russian state faces some sort of existential risk. So when the state itself or the Russian nation is under direct existential threat, that's a circumstance in which nuclear weapons could be used per this popular understanding of the Russian doctrine. So fast forward to today, the New York Times just reported within the past couple hours something that you could discern if you were paying attention for the past couple months, which is that now it's officially reported that the Biden administration at the highest levels is, quote, warming on the idea of directly operationally coordinating a Ukraine incursion into Crimea. And that's probably the perfect representation of how this escalatory spiral has occurred. Because when the war first started, it wasn't even really contemplated virtually anywhere.
The annexation of Crimea, the annexation of Crimea happened 9 years ago, or 8.5 years ago, in 2014, under the Obama administration, that did practically nothing in response. It imposed a few sanctions and the like because Obama had the very realistic or realist view in foreign policy jargon that who controls Crimea is not of a vital interest to the United States, especially worth risking a war with the United States over. In fact, everybody acknowledges that whatever the percentage is, the vast majority of people in Crimea prefer to be under the sovereignty of Moscow than Kiev. And, let me show you this video that I want to put up that also shows just how far this discourse has gone now. It's from the Prime Minister of Finland. I believe she's speaking at Davos at the World Economic Forum. But here's her view about what the objective is when it comes to Western support for Ukraine. What is the way out? What is our objective? Here's what she had to say about that.
Last 3, 4 years, 5 years, Europe has the staying power to see it through, to continue supporting Ukraine, deterring Russia, dealing with the energy issues that arise out of it.
I think the only message that we need to send that we will support Ukraine as long as needed. 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. We will support Ukraine as long as needed.
I mean, Michael, it's insanity. I mean, even I didn't think, and I don't think most war skeptics thought that we would ever get to the point where we would say about Ukraine and the war with Russia that we're basically willing to have it be our new Afghanistan, that for however long it takes, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, we're in it for the long haul until Ukraine ends up victorious. And of course, the big difference with Afghanistan being that no one in Afghanistan has nuclear weapons, whereas, of course, the nuclear doctrine of Russia, like any other nuclear armed country, is that the reason we have nukes, besides deterrence, is to use them in the event that there's an existential threat to our existence, which they regard the war in Ukraine as being. How did we just escalate so radically from February of 2022, not even a year ago, 11 months ago, to the point we are now, where someone like she can say that, and it seems perfectly natural, even though had she said that in February of 2022, she would have been deemed by pretty much everybody to be insane.
Right. Well, I had a suspicion that it could escalate along these lines from the very outset. And that suspicion was grounded in a recognition of a long-established pattern, which is that when a military intervention is initiated, it eventually takes almost on a life of its own or a logic of its own, because it's a huge bureaucratic enterprise. There are huge deployments of manpower and resources that the people in charge of administering those resources feel they need to get a return on their investment on. It results in the creation of all kinds of new jobs and responsibilities and professional and political investments. And so even if you can't necessarily at any given point discern what the ultimate objective is supposed to be, you can discern that there's this whole apparatus created around the war effort. And that's what I saw firsthand, and part of the reason why I went to Poland very early on, because the US immediately started building up a brand new installation, a military base effectively, 60 or so miles from the Ukraine border, at an airport in the city Yeshiv, where the U.S. was basically presiding over the infusion of weaponry, mostly from the United States itself, but also from peripheral NATO countries. Basically, the U.S. was the prime mover in funding and arming the entire war effort on Ukraine's part from the outset. So when that is the case, of course, there's going to be all kinds of psychological and emotional and political and professional commitments to seeing through that task to what they regard as its full completion. And the problem in discerning that the escalation was happening in real time is that it's incremental, right? And this happens throughout wars over the course of history, even World War II. I mean, people think that, Pearl Harbor happened, the U.S. got involved, and then all of a sudden we're atomic bombing Japan, and that was always the course the war was going to go on. No, I mean, the U.S. actually had fairly modest, or relatively more modest, ultimate war aims when it first entered the war. At first, after Pearl Harbor, it was only years later, after these conferences and so forth, between Stalin and Churchill and Roosevelt, that it was decided that total victory was the only possible option to bring about a resolution to the war, which was then the justification, more or less, for the atomic bombing of Japan and the also incredibly vociferous aerial bombardment of Germany. And it's a similar sort of logic here. I mean, when the war first started, the Ukraine war first started, Zelensky and the top Ukrainian government officials didn't give any indication that they thought that one of the viable objectives would be to militarily retake Crimea. That was almost crazy to even contemplate. Right. But then the war, the resource commitment and the financial commitment and the political, emotional, kind of psychic commitment to the war on the part of the U.S. Primarily increased over time. And so you saw by June of last year, basically the top military advisors and defense officials in the Ukraine government were outright requesting that the United States essentially furnish them a brand new military. When the war first started and Biden announced how the U.S. was going to provide aid, he almost framed it as though it was this very limited humanitarian mission with maybe some small arms and javelin missiles thrown in for good measure. But on the whole, it was this kind of humanitarian mission. Now, not just the tanks, but the Patriot missiles, the long-range missile systems, the howitzers. There's no limit, apparently, to what the U.S. is willing to send it from its own arsenal to Ukraine, and not just send, right, but operationally coordinate the combat missions pursuant to the sending of those weapons. And yes, so for Sanna Marin, this Finland prime minister, it's funny, like I subjected myself to listening to her entire interview with Fareed Zakaria, and thank God Fareed was on the scene to ask the hard questions.
Of course,
as
he
always
always does. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank
God.
It's funny, Michael. First of all, the logic of how this works as I'm listening to you reminds me a lot. I don't know if you've ever looked for an apartment in New York City. It works a lot in that way in a lot of different, cities where you start off and you say, okay, my maximum rent that I'm going to even consider, and you tell your real estate agent this is $3,000 a month.
But it doubles in a week.
Yeah, and then suddenly shows you an apartment that you love and it's $3,400. You're like, all right, what's the difference? It's just $400 more. And now she knows you're willing to pay $3,400, so the next apartment she shows you is $3,900, and you justify it, well, what's another $500 more? How much I love this. And then suddenly, within like a couple of weeks, you're in a place that you never dreamed you would be in. And one of the interesting things is if you look at the history of polling data about American wars, and of course there's so many of them, so we have a long database there, the history is always the same. When the war is first proposed, because the emotions are so intense and so easily manipulated. Of course, everybody was horrified and disgusted seeing the things they showed us about Russian attacks on Ukrainian civilians. We didn't see the, kind of brutality and savagery of Ukrainian forces, so everybody kind of got angry. But the history is that, everybody supports a war, or the great vast majority of people support a war at first, like they did in Iraq, like they did in Afghanistan, like they did in Vietnam. And then maybe 15, 20 years later, the same vast majority will say, we've come to see that war as a mistake. I mean, it's amazing how it always happens, and somehow it's never the case that you can get people to ask those questions at the start of the war. The one war that I think people have overlooked a lot is the war in Libya, just because it was so fast, and compared to Afghanistan and Iraq and Vietnam and Korea and these other great American wars, it seems like it's very kind of insignificant, like a footnote in history. The reality, though, is if you go and look at what Barack Obama said when he finally got behind the war, that actually Hillary Clinton and Susan Rice and Samantha Power were pushing him to do, along with the French and the British, who were concerned about the Libyan petroleum that they really needed, that they thought Gaddafi was going to nationalize. If you go and listen to Obama's speech, he knew Americans were very war-weary. Remember, we weren't out of Iraq yet, let alone Afghanistan. And so Obama went at least twice. You can go read the speeches and say, look, I'm promising you we are not there for a regime change. That is not what we're doing. This is not a regime change war the way it was in Iraq and Afghanistan. All we're there to do is protect Libyan civilians by a no-fly zone over Benghazi or places like that. And within a matter of weeks, obviously the logic became, well, if we hate Gaddafi this much, how can we let him stay in power? Of course, then it has to become a regime change. And that was a case as well where, just by the way, the House Republicans voted against authorizing that war, and yet Obama went and did it anyway, which is just, a way of saying, hey, we're now involved in this incredibly dangerous war that the Congress never bothered to authorize or deauthorize, because that seems to be this kind of quaint relic of the past constitutionally, where Congress...
Didn't they invoke the war power resolution as well to object to the continuation of the war, or to at least begin the process of...
I mean, there were things that Republicans could have done had they were serious about their opposition, including defunding the war, which they never did, which gives you the kind of, proof that they wanted to posture against the war. The House Republicans did, but not really do anything to stop it, much the way Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats won the 2006 midterms by promising to fund the war in Iraq. And as soon as the Democrats won, the first thing Nancy Pelosi did was introduce an authorization on the floor of the House to continue funding the war in Iraq, because they wanted the war in Iraq to continue so they could run again on it in 2008. It's just amazing, though, the speed with which all of this happens. Let me show you, before we move on, let me just, you can comment on that, but I want to first show you a video that the DNC made in order to attack John McCain when he said, I think it was back in 2006 or 7, that it
was during the 2008 campaign that the DNC put out.
Yeah, when John McCain, right, they made an attack on John McCain because he was saying, look, and there's some logic to it. If we're going to go into Iraq and say we're there to change the regime and to build democracy for the Iraqi people that's going to help our security, which was his rationale and the rationale of neocons for doing the war in Iraq, at least the proffered one, then it may take 100 years, and that's fine if it does. Here's what the Democrats did to John McCain in an attack ad about his comments.
President Bush has talked about our staying in Iraq for 50 years.
Maybe 100. That'd be fine with me.
President Bush has talked about our staying in Iraq for 50 years.
Maybe 100.
If all he offers is more of the same, is John McCain the right choice for America's future? The Democratic National Committee is responsible for the content of this advertising.
4 years later, they would also go on to mock the Republican Party and Mitt Romney for warning about what a grave threat Russia was. But what do you make of that and just like the kind of overall history that I just described before we move on to the next topic?
Well, one of the chief attacks on McCain in the 2008 presidential campaign by Democrats was that McCain was so out of touch on Iraq that he was willing to stay at war there forever. Forever wars, right? Perpetual war. That became a mantra then, which was adopted by both parties as something that they wanted to avoid because the public was seen to be war weary. But Democrats, they railed against McCain because of that comment that he made where he's saying, maybe 50 years, maybe 100 years, who knows? Well, Sanna Marin, this prime minister of Finland, who now is touted as this girl boss type figure who's so inspiring to women everywhere in the world. I mentioned Fareed Zakaria, who interviewed her. One of the adversarial questions he came up with at the end was to gently ask her if she could comment on what it's like to be such an inspiration for women all over the world in her role as Finland prime minister, as though like little girls, in South America and Asia have posters of her on their walls and stuff in their bedroom.
If a woman can become prime minister of Finland, they can do anything.
Right, but she's seen as this like the image presented of her, which is admittedly sort of a superficial and like the media fixated on it in this like tabloid way. But she wore she wears like leather jackets. She goes to music concerts and festivals. She goes clubbing. She drinks. She parties, and yet she also is bringing Finland into a sprawling U.S.-led military alliance and renouncing its decades-long policy of military neutrality that it had maintained even during World War II, but now the threat of Russia and Ukraine is so extreme that it supersedes all that pre-existing precedent. And in the case of Sweden, which is like joining NATO in tandem with Finland, the policy of military neutrality that it had adhered to dates back to Napoleon, but that's all out the window now because of the supposedly existentially Hitler-like extreme threat of what's happening in Ukraine. So Sanna Marin is leading the charge on that, and she also has this like cool girl boss, doesn't take any crap from anyone image, and is being touted and has praise lavished upon her. And she makes that statement where, I don't know, who knows, 15 years, maybe 30, she said something like, the only message I want to send is that Ukraine must be supported for as long as it takes. And she's basically just importing that logic that John McCain expressed in the DNC attack with regard to Iraq, with regard to Ukraine, but nobody really seems to notice because she's this cool liberal interventionist type who, basically goes along with whatever the United States wants. And, it's funny, I listened to that whole interview. I subjected myself to both her and Fareed Zakaria, who, by the way, I'm not going to say because I don't want to subject anyone to liability here legally. But if you listen to it, her comments are so rote. It's like she was basically just given a talking point, like a literal sheet of talking points, a year or so ago, and has just imbibed them, and then can just rattle them off like someone's pulling the zip tie from her back, like one of those talking monkey toys or something. She says, that's for Ukraine to decide in terms of when the war will end. As long as it takes, as long as it takes line is what's repeated all the time by the Biden administration in terms of their commitment to Ukraine, because they'll say as long as it takes, and they specifically use the temporal phrasing rather than the material phrasing because they don't want to necessarily commit themselves to any particular weapon systems at any given time.
Or amount of money to spend.
Right.
It's so hard to keep track of the identity politics narrative. On the one hand, we're supposed to encourage and celebrate when women ascend to power because we're told that they're less likely to treat conflicts in a antagonistic or conflict-oriented way. There'll be less wars because they believe more in peaceful resolution. And then on the other hand, we're supposed to cheer when instead of having a man say those same things that we've heard from decades about the glories of endless war, we're instead hearing about it from a woman. We did a whole show on how identity politics is used to take the most banal and status quo perpetuating figures, like Hakeem Jeffries, for example, the new leader of the House Democrats, and try and make him into something revolutionary or inspiring using identity politics. The first ever black leader of a party in the House, or the first ever black swamp creature who is excellent at taking money from and then serving the interest of Goldman Sachs. I want to move on, Michael, to this story. The New York Times.
Can I make one quick two-sentence point on this just to sum up, and then we can move on to your other salacious topics because I know you're getting antsy.
Yeah.
So in terms of the escalatory nature of this conflict, just think about it in these terms, okay? This kind of sums it up. In December of last year, the Ukraine military launched long-range drone strikes inside territorial Russia, 300 miles away from the Ukraine border, including on a base that housed part of Russia's strategic nuclear bomber fleet. Okay, that happened in December of last year. And now, January of this year, we get these indications that the Biden administration is about to essentially endorse an offensive into Crimea. If I had told you 2 years ago or a year ago that those things would happen, and that would be the nature of U.S. warfare against Russia in terms of the U.S. basically providing the basis for all this to happen, you would have thought that sounds utterly insane. That sounds like the United States is at war with Russia. The two largest nuclear powers are at war with one another, which had been studiously avoided for the entire Cold War and then after by presidents of both parties and Russian leaders of differing ideological dispositions. That was basically abolished. You would think that whole frame of mind in terms of a war avoidance had been abolished if I told you those two facts. And now everyone is so inured to it that it barely even causes much of a reaction. There's certainly no opposition.
It's the frog in the boiling water problem where you just turn it up a little and a little and a little, and now we've just accepted the fact that the United States is at war with Russia. And the problem is, the only reason anyone's going to care about it is if Russia does something genuinely devastating, like use a tactical nuclear weapon on the battlefield. But we're not going to be afraid of that until it happens, by which point it'll be too late. All right, now, if you'll allow me to, I can finally move on to this other story that I actually want to talk to you about, which is the New York Times report on Auburn University, which, like several other universities, have banned the social media platform TikTok because it's owned by a Chinese company. And therefore, the concern is that they will collect and aggregate data on the people who I'm sure the Chinese Communist Party is fascinated with, which are students at Auburn University, invade their privacy, and otherwise surveil the United States. I think we have a graphic.
Dancing sorority girls.
Yeah, I think we have a graphic from, what's that? Okay, so there you see the headline from the New York Times story. You know, and before we get into the substance of it, let me show you this video of Republican Senator Marco Rubio, who has been more or less an outspoken critic of big tech censorship regime, but he now wants to enact legislation or have an executive order that would ban TikTok, not just on government phones like many governors have already done, but from the entire country.
He introduced a bill.
Right, he introduced this bill, exactly. Let's listen to him explaining it.
I want to ban TikTok for a very simple reason. They allow the Chinese Communist Party to gain access to all of the private data on any device in America that's using TikTok. That's our kids, that's phones connected to our kids' phones, and that's a national security threat, but it's a direct threat to our way of life, our economics. It's allowed them to interfere in the midterm elections. This company should be banned. I don't know why they're allowed to operate in the United States.
Now, first of all, that is the argument of the Chinese government for why they want to either ban Google and Facebook or in other ways make them adhere to Chinese demands, which is we don't trust American tech companies operating within our country. We think you're going to propagandize our kids. We think you're going to use it to destabilize our country. We don't want you here. And if you are going to be here, you're going to follow these rules. And everyone calls the Chinese government repressive and tyrannical for having done that. And now we turn around and we see Marco Rubio doing the same thing. The reality is there's all kinds of negotiations with TikTok to protect exactly these concerns, including having a third party supervise the way in which data is being curated, even allowing the US government a direct role in how content is being moderated, meaning censored on TikTok, which is reporting that we did a couple of weeks ago. So what is really going on here, Michael? I mean, the idea that they're using TikTok to spy on the country is preposterous for so many reasons. What is actually motivating this desire to ban TikTok?
Well, part of the reason I was so bemused in a dark way by this New York Times article on the banning of TikTok at Auburn University is because there's an element of just pure farce to it. So what happened was the Republican governor of Alabama, Kay Ivey, issued an executive order banning the use of TikTok by state employees on state-owned phones. And other states, mostly Republican states, have followed suit on this. And then in reaction, Auburn University imposes its own campus-wide ban on TikTok, but only from its own university-administered internet network. So when they announced the ban, they sent an email out or some notice out telling students that, while you can no longer use TikTok on campus-provided internet, don't worry, you can still use it on your own data plans on your own phone. You just got to log off the internet, and you could even still use it on Auburn-provided devices. So obviously, a ban like this, given the gigantic loophole that they introduced it with, is not actually about really banning TikTok, right? Because it's not banned. It still can be used by anybody who wants to use it on the physical Auburn University campus. And the students who were quoted in the article attest to that they'll keep using this because it's been integrated into, I don't know, their social life or whatever. But because everybody's now convinced that President Xi in China is very interested in having micro fine-tuned data on the dancing habits of Auburn University sorority sisters, there has to be these symbolic decrees about how it's banned. And I'm interested in this issue, and I'm still developing thoughts on it. I'm actually curious what you think, because I notice a paradox here in terms of the broader sort of discussion of censorship as of late. The right, libertarians, etc., they are pretty unanimous in basically holding themselves out to be stridently anti-censorship at this point. They think that the censorship power is being wielded, and they accurately think this, that the censorship power is being generally wielded by who they regard as their ideological or political or cultural adversaries, and their adversaries increasingly do wield that power at the social media companies within the Biden administration and other entities and so forth. So they're basically taking on a more and more hardline pro-free speech, anti-censorship position. They're out, there's a chorus of outrage every time there's a new revelation from the Twitter files about what Twitter was doing to stifle, conservative speech and so forth. And all that I think is merited in terms of their reaction on the substance. I mean, it is merited substantively how they feel and how they maybe have even modified their position from the past when maybe they had more of their political and ideological peers in positions of power to do the censoring, and maybe they weren't as steadfast in opposing it. So I get that. And yet, at the same time, none of them, or very few of them from what I gather, seem to perceive any contradiction from being this newfound proponent of, untrammeled free speech and simultaneously demanding, as Rubio does here in his gloriously bipartisan bill that's, by the way, also co-sponsored in the House by Raja Krishnamurthy, a Democrat from Illinois, to not just ban TikTok from like federal government phones or something, which was done or which, actually got into the National Defense Authorization Bill last December, but to ban literally all American adults from using the service. Okay, so they're calling for, the sponsors of this bill and many people, even you see in conservative media, and I get all of them telling me on Twitter how evil TikTok is and how much they support this potential action. They want the government to wield unprecedentedly sweeping censorship powers to ban an entire platform based on some notion that there's this huge, extremely scary risk inflicted on the American populace by the existence of TikTok. They don't really spell out with much specificity what that risk supposedly is, other than, it's connected to China and China's bad and China might do something with the data, which, please, you got to give a little bit more of a specific rendition of what you're saying is this such a massive threat that you want the government to impose unprecedentedly sweeping censorship powers on American citizens, not on any foreign citizen, on American citizens. So adults are no longer permitted to use a social media platform that maybe they enjoy or whatever. Now, I'm not a personal fan of TikTok. I don't use it. It seems a bit trivial, but so is like 99% of what's on the internet. So I don't understand on the merits why TikTok is this gigantic menace that we're all supposed to turn off our critical faculties in relation to because we chant Chinese Communist Party 3 times in the mirror, and then anything is suddenly justified. So I don't really see much of an attempt to reconcile the pro-free speech stance with this new pro-censorship stance on TikTok because China's bad.
I think, we're going to devote a show or several shows in the future to questioning and examining the right's perspective when it comes to China. Obviously, this is all about China and fears about the Chinese government. And one can't help in some way but notice a obvious similarity between how Democrats talk about Russia and how Republicans talk about China, in the sense that anything that's connected to Russia or anyone who's connected to Russia or anyone who in any way suggests that maybe the threat of Russia is being overblown immediately becomes a sympathizer of Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin. This parallel between a similar vision on the right, but when it comes to China, namely that, no, it's not Russia that's the great threat to the United States, but it's China. No, we shouldn't fight a war with Russia over Ukraine. We should fight a war with China over Taiwan, and how that reconciles as well with this kind of new military doctrine that President Trump, among others, advocated, which is the only reason you go to war or pursue conflict with a country is that they're actually going to try and attack your country or in some way undermine its national security, which I don't think a case can be made that China imminently is going to do so. And if people on the right find it so offensive that the United States should fight a war to protect Ukraine from Russian aggression because it has nothing to do with the United States, why is it so obvious that, as Joe Biden says he wants to do, we should go to war with China in order to protect Taiwan? I think there's a lot of kind of reflexive reactions to anything related to China when it comes to the right that isn't very well thought through. Maybe China is this new grave threat, and maybe we want another 80-year Cold War. And, it's the FBI and the CIA and the Pentagon primarily demanding the banning of TikTok, which the right regards as nefarious agencies. So maybe one ought to be questioning as well why these security agencies seem so intent on a new 50-year Cold War with China, given, on the other hand, what the right, I think, accurately regards as the very sinister and deceitful nature of these security services. It's something we're not going to be able to resolved now. I think we're going to devote several shows to having kind of debates among people with different views. I did that once before when I was at The Intercept, where I interviewed this incredibly smart professor and diplomat from Singapore. And I put Matt Stoller on as well, and they had very opposite views on China. We're going to have people like that on because I think it's really important to start questioning in a more explicit and direct way the right's kind of reactionary aggression toward China and whether it makes sense in light of these other principles, including the one that you said, which is, I've been talking for months now about how I'm so offended by the EU's banning of Russian media. Like, you're not allowed, if you're in the EU, to platform RT or Sputnik. And my argument has always been, what right does the government have to tell your neighbor that they can't watch Russian state media? Warn them about how it's propaganda, but some people will still want to watch Russian state media for whatever reasons. Maybe they think there's news in there. Maybe they think there's a benefit in seeing Russian propaganda and seeing the other side of the war. But if you're offended by that, as I am, why are you not equally offended by the attempt by Marco Rubio to tell you and your neighbor that even if you want to use TikTok, you will now be banned from doing so as an adult because it is now prohibited for that company to operate in the United States? Maybe there's good reasons. I just haven't heard any. So anyway, I just want to ask for your deference to kind of keep all the ideas that you have about this to yourself, because I want to get to this last issue. We're a little over time, and I think, like I said, treating the question of China requires a lot more thought and time than we had to devote to it right now. So I just want to ask you about this last question to follow up on reporting that you did when you happened to be in Scotland. And to remind people, Scotland implemented a bill and enacted it into law despite, 65% of the population opposing. And the law gave...
Right. Or another way of putting it, only around 20% of the population was found in the polling to actually support the measures contained in the bill.
Exactly. So a very small percentage of the population supported this bill. The Scottish elite were overwhelmingly in favor. And what the law did was granted Scottish citizens the right to have their gender changed and to be treated as the other gender through nothing more than self-declaration. So you are a boy, one day you wake up and say, today I'm a girl. You don't need any medical certification. You don't need any proof of treatment. Now everyone is required to treat you as a girl. It even includes the ability of young children to have certain rights based on self-declaration as well. Now, we covered that when you were here. We talked about the aspects of that bill, but what's happening now is Scotland, which is part of the United Kingdom, still needs what usually is a technicality, which is royal assent, or in other words, the Queen or the King now has to approve of any laws implemented by Scotland, which usually is a formality, but the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom technically has the right to intervene and block laws from being implemented, and they're now doing that, it seems, and so you are actually about to have an unprecedented political crisis involving the sovereignty of Scotland and the ability of the United Kingdom to stay together over a trans law that only 20% of the population in Scotland actually supports. What's going on here?
Yeah, actually, when I was on your show, I guess it was last month, and we talked about this, I actually raised the prospect that, hilariously enough, or maybe I shouldn't say hilarious because I want to be mindful of the sensitivities here around anyone who might be watching, because I know you have a very sensitive audience, that this issue could provoke a pretty seismic constitutional crisis in the United Kingdom. And now, bear in mind, Scotland had powers devolved to it by the central Westminster government of the United Kingdom, Parliament in London, in the late 90s under Tony Blair, because the idea was they want to expand democracy around the country by having these having devolved powers, especially to Scotland, where there's been a something of a nationalistic movement for a long time, although it gained a lot of momentum, especially since 2015. But the Scottish Parliament itself, which passed this law just before Christmas, is a very new legislative body. It only came into existence in 1999. So a lot of its actual authorities have been untested, right? It's not like it's existed since time immemorial, like the Parliament in London. And so one of the provisions in what's called the Scotland Act of 1998 that Blair ushered through Parliament to give Scotland the ability to create their own regional parliament allowed for the possibility that in circumstances where it is determined that a bill passed or a measure enacted in Scotland could, in some sense, conflict with law elsewhere in the United Kingdom, that the Prime Minister or the Parliament had the right to basically carry out a veto of the bill by blocking its ability to achieve royal assent, which, as you know, is almost always just a formality because, like, the monarch is not involved in day-to-day politics. And this would be the first time that this power was ever invoked because, the prior governments would have been wary about provoking Scotland or creating some kind of, constitutional conflict that could then maybe inflame support for Scottish independence, which came up for a vote in 2014 and failed. But something like 44% of the Scottish population did vote in favor of Scottish independence. So the Prime Minister, which has been a conservative for the past 13 years, has to walk a fine line. They don't want to overly antagonize Scotland, right? Well, now they've done it because the Scottish Nationalist Party, which is the ruling party in Scotland and has, a coalitional alliances with the Green Party, they, for out of nowhere, I mean, maybe not out of nowhere is the wrong way of putting it, but all of a sudden it was just taken as gospel that the number one governing priority of Scotland had to be this gender recognition law so that 16-year-olds could self-declare their gender identification, and then that would be legally binding in its recognition. That was all of a sudden the chief priority of the Scottish government. Now, I mentioned last time, and it's gotten even worse since you have the ambulance drivers on strike in the United Kingdom, you have border inspectors on strike, teachers just declared that they're going on strike this week. Doctors are threatening to go on strike. I mean, the society is at a standstill. And Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland, and her party and others and these activists, they're laser focused on the gender recognition bill so that a 16-year-old...
It's unbelievable that the existence of the United Kingdom could actually be imperiled as a result of the devotion of the Scottish elite to this bill. Let me just show you, and the audience, a video of a member of the Green Party in Scotland about what they plan.
It's a member of the Scottish Parliament, so not the central government Parliament.
Exactly, and a member of the Scottish Parliament who is a member of the Green Party, correct? It's
yes.
Laying out their plans for where they want to go next. Let's watch that.
Let me ask you about what Keir Starmer said, which was his concern about age. Yes. You said, and I'm quoting you here, it would be, quote, appropriate and beneficial for children under 16 to have formal gender recognition. Is that to say that you would support, for example, an 8-year-old being able to have their sex legally changed?
I think in the committee that scrutinised this legislation, we heard from a wide range of trans people who knew well before they were 16 that they were trans. And I think we should be looking at processes where they can be recognised. That does not mean to say I'm saying we set an age at which it's fine. I think there will need to be much wider discussions around protection.
But below 16, you're thinking of a child below the age of 16 would have their own decision about whether to change their sex legally. So in theory, an 8-year-old could do that.
I think in principle, we should be exploring that.
So, Michael, I saw a video today of I don't know who this person is, but apparently he's a well-known sports commentator who was outraged.
You got a name?
What's that? I don't know his name.
Had his name in my head. He's just like in this blob of well-known sports commentators.
Yeah, he's a well-known sports commentator apparently, and he was genuinely outraged that there were several members of the NHL, the National Hockey League, which has people from all over the world now playing within it, all different religions and cultures and the like. Several of them were unwilling to wear the rainbow flag as part of their uniform. And this announcer was disgusted and had, did a whole rant. You go to watch a sports show to hear about hockey, to escape a little bit from, the difficulties and burdens of life, and suddenly you're being hectored about politics that maybe you do or don't agree with or aren't really sure. But he was, so angry that none of these people were expressing opposition to the LGBTQ movement. They just didn't want to wear the rainbow flag and said, it's my personal choice, my conscience is violated by it, my religion is violated by it, I should have the right. And I commented today because I was thinking about the fact that when I look back on what the gay and lesbian movement was, when I was in my 20s and 30s, the idea that it would ever arrive at the point when you would want to force them to wear the symbols of the gay and lesbian movement, what now is called the LGBT movement, was so far away from anything that anyone would have imagined. But the idea that the United Kingdom could actually break up over the question of whether 8-year-old children should be given the legal right to change their gender based on nothing more than their declaration it's just unimaginable. And I think it gets back to the kind of dynamic we talked about with how wars escalate, that just every day you kind of turn the heat up, and you suddenly realize before it's too late that you're in boiling water.
Well, Nicola Sturgeon, the first minister of Scotland, who was a staunch supporter of this bill and ushered it through the parliament, when the minister presiding over Scotland in Rishi Sunak's government announced that the decision had been made to invoke this provision of the Scotland Act and effectively veto the law. You should have seen her. I mean, it was. She said, "Democracy is under assault." The extravagance of her rhetoric. It was almost like there was a January 6th in Scotland over the gender recognition bill. Like the very foundations of Scottish society had been shattered. And yeah, I mean, it is amazing how quickly these dogmatic views have developed. And I don't even say dogmatic as a judgment in that I'm disagreeing or agreeing with them, but they do have congealed into a very sort of impenetrable dogma. That person whose clip you played, her name is Maggie Chapman, and she's a member of the Scottish Parliament in the Green Party, and the Green Party is very enraptured by this stuff. And she has also said, during the debate over the legislation last month, she said that, quote, sex is not, as some would like to imagine, binary and immutable. Now, I'm not somebody like, there's this genre of people on the internet who seem to spend all day thinking of nothing else but gender ideology, whether they're pro or con. I like to think that I'm not one of those people, but I can't help but notice that comments like that, which not that long ago, 5 years, 10 years, maybe even less, would have been seen as almost, you wouldn't even know what she was talking about, because it used to be the case that there was a jealously guarded distinction made and emphasized between sex and gender, because gender is socially constructed, right? So you could be fluid in your gender, as trans people were, and transition, but sex was immutable in that it's biologically ordained in terms of your gametes, right? Now she's discarding that distinction. And in fact, that's becoming more and more common. This guy, Chase Strangio, who I know you've had run-ins with at the ACLU, is like their point person on trans issues. He also now rejects the sex-gender distinction and says sex is also immutable effectively.
Yeah,
so that's when you have that dogma underlying the activism and the legislative activity, who's to say where this can go? I mean, it's amazing that
the conflict I had with Chase Strangio was about the fact that he is an ACLU lawyer who at the same time not only supported Amazon's decision to remove Abigail Schreier's book that was deemed anti-trans from Amazon, he said, this is a hill that I will die on. So I couldn't help but notice the irony of an ACLU lawyer proclaiming that his overarching value is supporting censorship of books with which he disagrees. I developed a lot of animosity toward the UK during the Snowden reporting. It was probably the most authoritarian culture of any I encountered in the West when I was doing the reporting. They detained my husband and threatened him with 20 years in prison for terrorism crimes simply because he was involved in the journalism. So I confess on some level that I would find it amusing if the United Kingdom finally disintegrated this old, archaic, pompous, ceremonial, empty, old empire just crumbled over this. That would actually amuse me, I confess. Michael, we got to go. We got to go. I know we have so many more things to say, but we're actually well over time. Okay. We have to go. You're always invited back on. We're happy to have you, and you can save your points.
I'm going to do the sad face because I can't make my blazing hot comment on. Yep.
What's that?
Well, I mean, I don't want to say that's reciprocated, but maybe I'll allude to that.
Well, you were desperately battling to stay on for as long as you could, so I think the proof is in the pudding. Thank you, Michael. We really appreciate that you're taking the time to talk with us.
Glenn, I know you can't relate to being uncontrolled in your ranting, so I'll have to inform you about this psychology of that sometime.
Have a nice night, Michael. Thank you. So that concludes our show for this evening. As always, we will now be moving to Locals, the community-based platform on Rumble, where we will do our interactive after show. We will take your questions, respond to your feedback. To become a member of our Locals community, you just click the red join button right underneath the video, and that will entitle you not just to access to our after show, but all of my written journalism as well, which is now appearing exclusively on Locals. Thank you for watching. We hope to see you back tomorrow night and every night at 7 o'clock p.m. Eastern, live right here on Rumble.